12 months ago to the day, I came here to deliver my inaugural lecture, and once again I mount this podium, somewhat as mad Heracles in Women of Trachis, agonized and enraged, mounts to the summit of his funeral pyre. He is in agony because he wears the irremovable blood-dyed shirt of the centaur Nessus, a false and deadly gift, the burden of which is intolerable, but which he cannot be rid of, save through self-immolation by fire. Eliot's lines for an old man come to mind. When I lay bare the tooth of wit, the hissing over the arched tongue is more affectionate than hate, more bitter than the love of youth, and inaccessible by the young. As do the lines from the second section of Little Gidding, 1942. From wrong to wrong the exasperated spirit proceeds, unless restored by that refining fire where you must move in measure like a dancer. The mode here may be Dantean, Purgatorio 26. It may be elusively Yeatsian, The Tower, 1928, page 2 and 10 and 11. The Winding Stair, 1933, page 54. But the matter is also Heraclean, if it matters. Poets invent, even their confessions. The 17th century Samuel Butler, author of Hudibras, wrote in his commonplace book, Plato banished poets out of his republic, and yet forgot that that very commonwealth was merely poetical. And of course, Eliot was all of 54 when he published Little Gidding. At the date of The Tower, Yeats was 63. When he published The Winding Stair, he was 68. I am 7 months short of 80. No, one has to say that differently, doesn't one?
I am 7 months short of 80. But still sound in wind and a limb.
So I'm 7 months short of 80. And I take it that my clown's rule is to exasperate, and not only in small meannesses, such as giving you the page number on which a citation appears in the first edition of The Tower, but neglecting to give you the title of the poem. Why do I commence this lecture with a half-comic travesty of the poet's craft? I've moved the mic. Can you still hear me? So why do I commence this lecture with a half-comic travesty of the poet's craft? Partly because I am almost past caring. Partly because I still care too much. I here recollect a sentence from the poet-critic Peter Wigham and the critic Denis Gocher, appended to Ezra Pound's translation of Sophocles' Women of Trachis, London 1956, first published in the Hudson Review 1954. It is plain, they say, and they are describing the culture of the 1950s. It is plain that unbelief is accompanied by inanition and low vitality. At the date of the first British publication of Pound's translation, I was 24, and you are entitled to say that I am still marooned there, the angst of my youth compounded by the exacerbations of old age, and that, contrary to my general outlook and insistence, today's British cultural climate is notable for its vigour and promise. The flourishing poetry lists of Faber, Bloodaxe, Carcanet, the plethora of literary prizes, the prominence given to literary awards by the BBC News and Cultural Affairs programmes. Nothing at all like the inanition and low vitality of 60 years ago. On the 5th of September last, the Poet Laureate gave an interview to The Guardian in which she observed that the poem is the literary form of the 21st century. It's able to connect young people in a deep way to language. It's a language as play. With the last four words, I'm in entire agreement. The basic fact to be understood about this strange art is that it is entirely an art of invention. And the major justification for rhyme is that it stimulates one to invent even more wildly. Anyone who has ever taken creative delight in limerick and clerihue knows this to be the case. Our pleasure in the lunatic, pedantic genius of William McGonagall is a case in point. For him, the exigencies of rhyme urge him to reinvent the stunningly obvious, so that the stunningly obvious has never before appeared with quite this intensity of solemn, imbecile hubris. I think that one might learn something, if only a little, from this, as one can certainly learn things of value from the ways in which films are cut and in which great comedians, such as Ken Dodd, pace their jokes. My assent to Professor Duffy's argument falters beyond this point. She proposes that the poem is a form of texting. It's the original text. It's a perfecting of a feeling in language. It's a way of saying more with less, just as texting is. I would not agree that texting is a saying of more with less, and that it in this respect works as a poem. As the laureate says, poetry is condensed. Text is not condensed, it is truncated. What is more, it is normally an affectation of brevity. To express two as two and you as you intensifies nothing. Texting is like the old ticker tape, highly dramatic and intense if it's reporting Wall Street crash or the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, not through any inherent virtue of the machine. Is the breaking news that runs at the foot of the screen on the BBC News channel condensed and consequently poetic? I fail to see how anyone could rationally claim that it is. Again, texting is linear only. Poetry is lines in depth, designed to be seen in relation or in deliberate disrelation to lines above and below. The Guardian interviewer, Joanna Moorhead, quotes a poem by Professor Duffy, written in memory of her old English teacher. It's quoted as text. You sat on your desk, / swinging your legs, reading a poem by Yeats, / to the bored girls, except my heart stumbled and blushed, / as it fell in love with the words. I believe the eloquence of this might be enhanced if the third line were allowed to retain its position beneath the second. But what I really wish to say is compare and contrast the rhetoric of this poem with the rhetoric of Yeats's Among School Children, The Tower, 1928, pages 55 to 60. It seemed that our two natures blent into a sphere from youthful sympathy, or else to alter Plato's parable into the yolk and white of the one shell. Clearly, by this point, Yeats has withdrawn his interest, or the major element of his interest, from the children and the kind old nun in a white hood with whom he began his rhymed meditation. The laureate's concern does not, so to speak, wander. Is her poem therefore superior to Yeats's for this reason, that her imaginative focus does not withdraw into the matter of her own creativity, as his does? Well, I don't think so, and I don't think that she would ever make the claim that it is ethically or imaginatively superior for being democratic rather than Platonic aristocratic, as his poem is. What sublimity of mind must have been his, who conceived how to communicate his most secret thoughts to any other person, though very far distant, either in time or place, speaking to those who are not yet born, nor shall be this 1,000 or 10,000 years, and with no greater difficulty than the various collocation of little characters upon a paper. The writer here is Galileo, and he is, in the words of John Arthos, in his book Milton and the Italian Cities, 1968, marveling at the nature of language. Carol Ann Duffy's poem relates that her heart fell in love with the words as her teacher was reading a poem by Yeats. She and I are closely akin here. I began marveling at the nature of language when I was given a copy of Palgrave's Golden Treasury as a Sunday school prize at around the age of 9 or 10. Looked at from another angle, however, it seems equally arguable that our inspiration and love took different forms. Basing my own view entirely on the Guardian interview, we have not met and we have not talked things over. I would consider it fair, as I've already suggested, to describe her as an ethical and cultural democrat who would naturally rejoice at the flourishing poetry lists of Faber, Bloodaxe, and Carcanet, at the continuing surge of interest in creative writing courses, at the plethora of literary prizes. When Galileo writes as he does, marveling, as John Arthos says, at the nature of language, he is doing so very much in the spirit of the 17th century Tuscan academies, whose aristocratic and intellectually elite members welcomed John Milton to their company during his Italian visit of 1638 to 9. By the time of his arrival in Italy, Milton had already written On the Morning of Christ's Nativity, The Solemn Music, L'Allegro nel Penseroso, The Ludlow Masque, and Lycidas, all of them poems marveling as Galileo witnesses in his dialogue on the great world systems at the nature of language, and all of them structures worthy of our undiminished admiration. Judging entirely by what she says in her Guardian interview, I would guess that the laureate and I come from not dissimilar backgrounds, and that we might both be described, in the cant of the day, as children of the underprivileged. Both my parents left school almost 100 years ago at the age of 13, with no academic qualifications whatsoever. I would find it difficult to explain why one such child develops as its adult creative philosophy a generous, all-embracing, egalitarian literary missionary zeal. The Guardian refers to her tirelessly touring the country visiting schools, while the other, insofar as it has notoriety, is latterly known as a notorious literary elitist. Except that obviously in the latter case, elitist must mean something other than celebrity-orientated. When I was in one of the junior forms at Bromsgrove County High School in Worcestershire, it may have been shortly before the end of the Second World War or shortly after it, our English teacher, Anne Gledhill, gave us a poem by Auden to comment on. It was the title poem of his book, Look Stranger, published some 9 years earlier in 1936. Here at the small field's ending, pause where the chalk wall falls to the foam, and its tall ledges oppose the pluck and knock of the tide, and the shingle scrambles after the sucking surf, and the gull lodges a moment on its sheer side. The first thing I would say now about the stanza is that it displays an almost excessive mannerism of technique, as in the second line, which combines alliteration, falls, foam, with heavy internal rhyme and assonance, chalk, wall, falls, and how the remainder of the stanza relishes full and half rhyme, pluck, knock, suck. In 1944-45, I believe, the concept of technical mannerism would have been quite outside my field of reference. I do recall noticing that the word sucking is broken across the line ending. I can't recall precisely what I said, but it was to the effect that so placed, the stanza minutely enacted what it described, line 6 in effect, sucking down part of line 5 into itself. It was the simultaneous awakening in me of critical acumen and sensuality. Though I wasn't wholly aware of the sensuality until later, I believe I knew from that moment what critical acumen might entail. Anne told me many years later that it was my 12 or 13-year-old response to this small felicity that led her to think that there might be a future for me as a professional student of literature. Dear Anne, she was quite wrong, of course. I had no future as a professional student of literature. My future was to appear before the crème of a transient intelligentsia as a sinister old harlequin bellowing for a pittance some gibberish about the shirt of Nessus. I would wish to add, however, that when earlier in this lecture I quoted 3 lines of Eliot's Little Gidding, I did so not from a standard collected edition, but from a second impression of the first pamphlet issue of the poem printed on atrocious wartime paper in 1943. The first printing had been 1942. As I'm sure you know, the 4 poems comprising 4 quartets were originally issued in separate wrappers and predated their appearance in hardcover book format. 4 quartets first appeared in hardback volume form in the UK in 1944. And yes, I know there's a bibliographical glitch with reference to Burnt Norton, but don't stop me now. I have the bit between my teeth and I'm well away. So we'll leave that. The nub of the matter is that my 4 pamphlet editions of 4 quartets were gifts from her, not while I was at school, but later. If I am an elitist, it is as my tribute to her and others of similar background, such as my parents. Anne Gledhill was born on a public housing estate in an industrial town in what was then the West Riding of Yorkshire. I don't have an exact date. My guess would be in or around 1918. She went to Bedford College, University of London, where she obtained first-class honours, but was unable to take up the proffered research opportunity because of straitened family circumstances. You may readily comprehend the bitter contempt with which I respond to political careerists of whatever party who currently attempt to assuage the wrath of a cheated and embittered nation with assurances that they and they alone will ensure that the doors of higher education are henceforth to be opened to receive children from underprivileged backgrounds. Those, it may be the majority of my audience, who have come in expectation of my opinions on the August riots, will already be somewhat restless. The first thing to be said in the ongoing rhetoric of my argument is that the riots were, in their horrible way, thoroughly conventional, even traditional. They were reminiscent of the major 18th century disturbances. The 1710 Sacheverell riots in London, the 1736 Porteous riot in Edinburgh, the 1780 Gordon riots again in London, the 1791 Priestley riots in Birmingham. Sacheverell in 1710 was a Church of England rabble-rouser, a monarchist and a Tory, who incited the mobs to attack religious dissenters and Church of England latitudinarians. The Porteous riots in Edinburgh, which in certain details, particularly a police shooting, perhaps most closely anticipate the Tottenham outbreak, are imaginatively recreated in Walter Scott's finest novel, The Heart of Midlothian. The Gordon riots, for which see Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, were anti-Catholic in origin. They lasted for 8 days, caused the deaths of more than 300 people, and, it is said, resulted in more damage to property in London than would result from the popular uprising in Paris at the time of the French Revolution. But I have been, in fact, from the opening sentences of this address, speaking to the topic of poetry, policing, and public order. When the laureate speaks to the Guardian columnist of the tremendous potential for a vital new poetry to be drawn from the practice of texting, she is policing her patch. And when I beg her, with all due respect to her high office, to consider that she may be wrong, I am policing mine. What Professor Duffy desires to do, I believe, and if so, it is a most laudable ambition, is to humanize the linguistic, semantic detritus of our particular phase of oligarchical consumerism, and for the common good, she is willing to have quoted by the Guardian interviewer several lines from a poem by herself that could easily be mistaken for a first effort by one of the young people she wishes to encourage. I have here in mind, you will recall, the lines in memory of her English teacher, lines printed by the Guardian as lines of prose intersected by diagonal slashes, which of course is not correct because lines of verse should be intersected by vertical lines. You sat on your desk, slash, swinging your legs, reading a poem by Yeats, slash, to the bored girls, except my heart stumbled and blushed, slash, as it fell in love with the words. I respond to this excerpt in two ways, each radically incompatible with the other. My first response is, this is democratic English pared to its barest being, and I would not myself have the moral courage to write so. My simultaneous incompatible response is, this is not democratic English, but cast-off bits of oligarchical commodity English, such as is employed by writers for Mills and Boon, and by celebrity critics appearing on A Good Read or The Andrew Marr Show. Now, if we turn immediately to Carol Ann Duffy's poem for Armistice Day, The Christmas Truce, printed in the Saturday Guardian Review 12/11/11, we have something radically different. But it was Christmas Eve, believe. Belief thrilled the night air, where glittering rhyme on unburied suns treasured their stiff hair. But it was Christmas Eve, believe. Belief thrilled the night air, where glittering rhyme on unburied suns treasured their stiff hair. So that although thrilled and glittering are words that come with a standard poetry kit, treasured is beautifully, beautifully chosen and placed. And I cannot readily imagine any texted message in which it might conceivably found to anticipate or emulate the resonance it has in Carol Ann Duffy's stanza. Something instantaneous occurs when a word is used effectively, I would dare to say magically. For an instant, the poem seems to hover over itself, as if aware of itself, as a well-struck thing resonating. In the course of my inaugural lecture, exactly 12 months ago, I stated that during my tenure of this office, I would give no reading to the university of my own poems. To do so would seem an exploitation of my academic appointment. I abide by that self-imposed rule. It has occurred to me, however, that from time to time, it may be essential to the development of a critical argument to cite a phrase or two that I have myself written, and such an occasion presents itself now. In 1983, I published a poem of 400 lines with the title, The Mystery of the Charity of Charles Péguy. It contains the line, to dispense with justice or to dispense with justice. That is to say, to dispense, comma, with justice, semicolon, or, comma, to dispense with justice. In late 2000 or early 2001, I received a letter from Lord Windlesham, at that time Principal of Brasenose, requesting my consent to his use of that line as part of an epigraph to the final volume of his 4-volume series, Responses to Crime. and further to his use of the words dispensing justice as his book's title. I was happy to accede to his request, and in due course received a signed complimentary copy, which I greatly value. The title page, in fact, carries a double epigraph. The second citation is from my book, but it is preceded by a quotation from the foreword to Criminal Justice System Business Plan, 2000-2001, the joint authorship of which is given as the Attorney General, Home Secretary, and Lord Chancellor, that is, the three principal government ministers of justice. Their quotation reads, "To dispense justice fairly and efficiently, and to promote confidence in the rule of law." Windlesham's acknowledgement page begins, "The subtitle of this volume, Dispensing Justice, derives from the two frontispiece quotations. In giving permission to reprint the brief but telling extract from one of his poems, Hill remarked that such a use confirmed his belief that poetry is an art of public significance. The contrast is apt," he goes on, "between his precise use of words and punctuation and the overarching aims of the ministerial mission statement." Well, if I may be allowed an impertinent paraphrase, Windlesham is saying that by precise use of punctuation, Hill is indicating that law, like poetry, necessitates due attention to the minute particulars, that the humanity is in the detail, and that, in contrast, the ministerial wording is a kind of trade flotation. In seeing how the two sentences, mine and that of the ministerial pronouncement, are oxymoronically related, David Windlesham shows himself to have a mind instinctively attuned to the proprieties of poetry, an art which is culturally or post-culturally shackled with the worst kind of sentimental improprieties. John had a strong poetic streak in him, open round brackets. He wrote poetry and read historical romances, close round brackets. I noted this only the other day in the obituary section of a college magazine. Not the magazine of my own college, Keble, I had better say. The late person deserving this tribute had been greatly distinguished in his own field, but I would irritably deny that poetry is to be considered as anyone's hobby. If you have a hobby, you're a hobbyist and ride a hobby horse, and, albeit cranky, are entirely harmless. Now, you may tell me that A.E. Housman, internationally renowned as a Latin scholar, seems to have regarded the writing of a Shropshire lad as the indulgence of a hobby. And I would agree with you that there were occasions when he affected so to regard it. Now, I am myself the hobbyist of a theory that we and our fellow Europeans are citizens not of democracies, but of finance oligarchies with aristocratic and democratic trimmings. In a month that has witnessed two elected European governments dissolved by fiat of an international finance rating agency, this does not strike me as a crazy suggestion. Last week, my local free rag in Cambridge announced the city's Winter Word Fest. I quote, "November is a terrible month for entertaining yourself at home, unless you're a fan of watching jungle-based celebrities swallowing news gonads, or aging stars attempting ill-advised high kicks in spangly ballroom outfits. Thank heavens, then, for Wordfest. The opportunity to escape from the banality of weekend telly and get your fix of intelligent and lively debate. What is so exemplary about this passage? It would not surprise me to learn that its author is a recent first-class honours graduate in English. turns on the assumptions in the use of the word banal, the assumption that if Weekend Telly is banal, the November Wordfest is not, that a phrase such as "get your fix of" makes manifest a high order of intelligent response intrinsically superior to the chavish delights of Weekend Telly. I would also want to add that the big festivals, the annual event at Hay-on-Wye, the Oxford Literary Festival, are not superior events to the November Wordfest. They are essentially book fairs, though without the chance excitement of finding anything good. And in the latter case, the way in which this university has or appears to have given its high intellectual repute as guarantee of worth to what is in brute fact a publisher's jamboree is, in my view, deplorable. In one of my previous lectures, I recollect, I said something to the effect that in writing poetry it was essential not to be oneself, not to be sincere, but to be inventive. I said that knowing how the cult of sincerity plays into the hands of the spivs and charlatans of our anarchical plutocracy. And I said it knowing that so to protest turns me into a parody of myself, a kind of senile Saint-Just of the Republic of Letters. Gratitude, decency, intelligence, faith, love itself, protest itself, have all been gutted and recycled in the festival-driven madness of commodity. And in this murderous wallow, it is of no consequence that John wrote poetry and read historical romances. Why couldn't he have built elaborate model railways and read Areopagitica or Fors Clavigera? I recently read a newspaper piece on Rory McGrath, who has written or is in process of writing or is contemplating writing his memoirs. He says the thing about writing comedy, which is what I've written mostly in my life, is that it's a very artificial and mechanical process. It's all about timing. Writing a book about your life is far easier because you're just writing what happened. What is noteworthy here is that McGrath could be understood as apologizing for the art of comedy. If so, he is, I think, seriously mistaken. And it might be far better for his autobiography if he were to apply the rules of comic writing to it. In order to do anything of worth in literature, you must create not what is newsworthy or praiseworthy in the terms of the festival pundits, but something that is self-contained and in which the stresses are right. It's all about timing, as Rory McGrath says, almost in spite of himself. And, as previously suggested, I am policing my patch when I insist that any poetry written today worthy of being read for anything other than antiquarian curiosity in 50 or 100 years' time will have been written with a kind of savage technical restraint, somewhat akin to Swift's Latin epitaph and Yeats's translation of it, mechanically and with a near-perfect sense of timing. It will not pat John on the head for writing wimpish poems in his dotage and reading historical romances, but will honor him for the outstanding work he achieved in his own field. And in John's case, it was indeed outstanding. The poetry, I regret to say, is not in the pity. The pity is triumphantly vindicated in the poetry, or it is not. To read Wilfred Owen as though for a distillation of appealing sentiment, which is also considered relevant, is not to do justice to that fine though uneven poet. You cannot read Rambo for sentiment and relevance. You cannot read Isaac Rosenberg for sentiment and relevance. You cannot read Pound's Peas and Cantos for sentiment and relevance. You cannot read Laura Riding or Marianne Moore for sentiment and relevance. Or rather, you could, but it would serve no honest purpose. Sylvia Plath, by the way, can be read for sentiment and relevance, and scores of thousands of impressionable people have read her in just this way and for those fatuously wrong reasons. But the best of her, as in the bee poems, is resistant to anarchical sentimental pillage and will resist oligarchical aesthetic devaluation as the best of Robert Lowell, chiefly but not exclusively the early Lowell, has resisted debasement. But let us not misunderstand one another. Oligarchy requires instantaneous, debased and debauched response. Joseph Goebbels fully mastered all its tricks. I would suggest that anyone who studies the relationship or disrelation between language structures and political structures, particularly oligarchy's relationship with anarchy, might wish to consider instances of German underground or openly resistant ethical writings, both Jewish and Christian, in the period 1933-1945, the two books by Victor Klemperer, Bonhoeffer's Ethics and Letters and Papers from Prison, the posthumously published letters of Helmut James von Moltke. In different ways, they're all discussing or meditating on veracity, its essential relation to the relaying of information as well as to the highest orders of creation. Bonhoeffer wrote, "Timeless and placeless ethical discourse lacks the concrete warrant which all authentic discourse requires." I think that's worth repeating. Bonhoeffer, "Timeless and placeless ethical discourse lacks the concrete warrant which all authentic discourse requires." I would say that the truly major events in literary critical scholarship during the past couple of decades have been the appearance of such works as David Norbrook's Writing the English Republic, 2000, or the analyses by Colin Burrow of the writers of the Henrician period, or Brian Cummings's Grammar and Grace on the interrelationship between Reformation theology and the verse and prose structures of the 16th and early 17th centuries. To take not quite at random a few phrases from Norbrook's chapter on Marvel's Horatian Ode on Cromwell's return from Ireland, "The regicide may have destroyed some forms of beauty, but it has opened the way to the sublime." That's page 267. Or Cromwell's wiser art is in the first instance a political skill that is needed to turn such plans into reality, but it also directly confronts the arts of the Caroline court, page 268. Norbrook is showing us how to evaluate a novel type of heroic style, the Republican sublime, and adding that an awareness of Marvel's stylistics in the Horatian Ode itself is aided by our awareness of this. Marvel is neither vehemently for the Republican sublime nor zealously against it, but is overall somewhat cool. And the coolness explains the ambiguous pitch of the ode, which many people have commented on without putting their finger quite so precisely upon the point. Such objective precision as we get in Norbrook's study of Marvel's Ode is nowhere apparent in literary criticism, to give it an archaic label. That now appears in the form of reviews of contemporary poetry and prose in the papers that were once called broadsheets, but are now tabloids. In the Guardian G2 on November the 7th, there appeared a review by Sam Leith of an exhibition of Sylvia Plath's drawings. I quote, "I spent my teens marinated in Plath's poetry. There's a school of thought, not a very honourable one, that this is evidence that I was a slightly morbid teenage girl trapped in the body of a slightly morbid teenage boy." End quote. The entire weight of the passage is directed at the interestingness of Mr. Leith, not at the significance or otherwise of Plath's drawings. Marinated is exactly of its time and place, as woolly bleaters or feathered tribe are exactly revelatory of minor 18th century pastoral verse. Turn to a lengthier passage. Plath read Freud and Jung and used them consciously in her poems. You could say she used the unconscious consciously. Symbols recurred and were reworked. All those white moons and black yew trees, fathers, husbands, white feet and black shoes, the black and white sea, always furious, the sinister flowers, the awful medical apparatus of bandages and scalpels, the bald doctors, the engulfing reds of blood and flame. The telltale phrase here is "all those," so characteristic in its anti-contextuality. What is Leith's purpose in this random list of symbols? Does he mean to reveal how deep Plath is? Or how knowing she is? Or how boring she is? Because taken in this pattern book way, the sinister flowers again resemble the feathered tribes of 18th century literary mediocrity. Leith is at once opinionated and without decisiveness or judgment, and in this is entirely representative of the oligarchic commodity style in which the creative faculty is sensed as being frenetic yet passive, exactly as consumer anarchy at the post-Christmas sales is at once frenetic and passive. Symbols recurred and were reworked. All those white moons, the awful medical apparatus of bandages and scalpels, the engulfing reds of blood and flame. Engulfing whom or what? Is Plath victim or perpetrator of such horrid destructive activity? Is this how the world is to Plath, or is it how Plath is to the world? It matters. One wants to know. The state of poetry wants to know. I want to know. I want to know how Mr. Leith would present a 3,000-word appreciation of the paintings of Jackson Pollock. Would it be on the level of the engulfing reds of blood and flame, or would it be minimally concerned with application? Because this word application, blending the ethical with the technical, would seem to me a key term in any approach we might take to Pollock's painting. In the mythical conversation I'm here conducting with the Poet Laureate on the question of poetry and democracy, I would wish to know her mind on the question of Walt Whitman's distinction between grand common stock on the one hand and mean flat average on the other. It is my strong conviction that anyone propounding or advocating an aesthetic and ethical continuity between texting and poetry would need to have at least a considered opinion on this matter. My own considered opinion, I scarcely need to stress this surely, is that texting is the very embodiment of the mean flat average, and that democratic poetry, such as the laureate writes and wishes to encourage school children to write, must be the expression of the grand common stock. True poetry, I hope to get away with this utterly vacuous phrase, is not a series of textings about the world which we have authored and desire to go on self-authorizing. It is a kind of intensely crafted and parallel world, but not an alternative or a better world, since it is not here to offer us escape. As a parallel world, it must possess its own gravity, gravity which can be interpreted in two ways, either as gravitas, an accomplishment of the old rhetoric, or as pondus, weight, a form of gravitational pull, specific gravity to be found in the semiologies of English, as recorded in the OED and in the inherited canon of poetic kinds, Shakespearean sonnet, Miltonic sonnet, Pindaric and Horatian ode, heroic couplet and blank verse, and so on and so on. The possession of gravitas does not rule out the possibility of obscenity. Indeed, I would here offer my opinion that in collision with anarchical plutocracy, as I believe us to be, obscenity in verse of the highest moral caliber is essential, because the twi-natured domain of civic cum private debauch, whether in the Florence of Dante's Commedia or in the London-Rome axis of 21st century Euro finance, has so much about it that requires a genius for the obscene to match. The theory and practice of poetry, I'm convinced, and this conviction is fundamental to my 15 lectures and will be phrased and rephrased throughout the course. My conviction is that the theory and practice of poetry is a part of the civil constitution. The theory and practice of poetry is a part of the civil constitution. I take that phrase from Francis Oakley's book, Politics and Eternity. Francis Oakley, who takes his title, Politics and Eternity, from a sentence in Michael Oakeshott's introduction to his edition of Hobbes's Leviathan, an edition first published in 1946, where Oakeshott says, "To establish the connection in principle and in detail, directly or mediately, between politics and eternity is a project that has never been without its followers. To establish the connection in principle and in detail, directly or mediately, between politics and eternity is a project that has never been without its followers." Again, a note of coolness, but not as trenchant as Marvell's towards Cromwell and the Republican Sublime, more like studied equanimity over the port. By the time I've read my way halfway, let us say, through the famous introduction to Leviathan, I intuit that Oakeshott would have to be enrolled in a checklist of those who indeed think in such terms, between politics and eternity. So why this sort of by this sort of combination room reserve in the phrasing, because I would set my own sense of the thing thereabouts. I think that when one writes in any significant way, one is in some sense between politics and eternity. And I would not try to hedge my bets on this statement with any kind of sort of grammatical nuance. I would say that to establish the connection in principle and in detail, directly or mediately, between disparate phenomena, seems to me a necessary continuation of any vision regarding the function of metaphor, from Aristotle to Eliot, Yeats, and Pound. Now, Oakeshott's Leviathan piece, together with his essay, The Voice of Poetry and the Conversation of Mankind, has greatly influenced a considerable number, I sound like Oakeshott, considerable number of liberal conservative academic moralists of about my age and maybe a shade younger. As I desire to continue the theme of poetry, policing, and public order in the 2 remaining lectures scheduled for this academic year, I shall take Oakeshott's 2 essays under review, with respect, but by no means with acclaim. He's a damn sight too civilized for my liking, and I do not think that in the present anarchy, being studdily civilized is the best riposte you can make to the oligarchical strut. Jonathan Swift, in The Conduct of the Allies, published exactly 300 years ago in 1711, declared that it is the folly of too many to mistake the echo of a London coffee house for the voice of the kingdom. And reading the review pages of cultural tabloids, you can see that very little has changed in the succeeding 3 centuries. And I believe that Swift might have thought less well of Oakeshott than Oakeshott would have considered merited by his own impeccable reasonableness of discourse in the face of the world's provocations. And if I had to choose between them, I would hope not to, because as I say, I do admire Oakeshott. I admire him temperately. If I had to choose between them, I would feel that I had to choose Swift, even at his most cantankerous and obscene.